In our next section, we're going to look at extending the bridge domain out of ACI using the layer 2 out, which different from our previous example where we were extending the EPG. The main difference is going to be that since we have two separate endpoint groups, they are not going to have communication to each other by default, and we're going to have to define a contract which is going to contain the filters and the subjects in order to either permit or deny the traffic between the two different endpoint groups. Now, specifically from a configuration point of view, the L2 out is also what the ACI calls an external bridge domain. So where we're going to start here is back under the Fabric tab, and instead of configuring the physical domain on the interfaces, we're going to configure the external layer 2 domain. We're going to go through the same wizard as we had previously done with the regular layer 2 access ports, but we'll see when we choose the domain as layer 2 bridge domain, it's going to create some different object constructs for us automatically on the back end. So let's go back to the GUI, and let's go under the Fabric tab, and then from Fabric tab we're going to go under our access policies, and then we're going to create an interface, port channel, or virtual port channel. Okay, next, before we actually make this change, let's go over to the 7Ks. And let me open up my diagram again. Okay, so over on 7K1 and 7K2, and what we're going to do on their end is simply configure all four of these interfaces as just regular layer 2 trunks. Okay, so no special configuration, just switchboard mode trunk, and no shut, and then any of the VLANs that they have locally configured are going to be trunking on those particular interfaces. Okay, specifically in our case, again, it's going to be VLAN 1002 and 1003, which are configured down towards the servers. So we have 1002 going this way, we have 1003 going that way. These addresses are 10.02.11/24 and 10.03.12/24. Okay, the gateways are .254 for each of these. Okay, so let's go back over to 7K1. And we're just going to start with a blank config for those interfaces. Default interface E1 7 to 8. Then interface E1 7 to 8, we'll say our switch ports, switchboard mode trunk, and no shut. Okay, then let's look at the show CLI history, unformatted pipe to show me the last, let's say 10 lines. Okay, so same exact thing we're doing on 7K2. So just starting back with a default config on those ports. Let's show run interface E1 7 to 8. Okay, so both of those are trunks. Okay, additionally, if we look at the on the 7Ks and then also on the 5Ks, okay, let's make sure that regular classical Ethernet switching is working. So if we look at the show spanning tree for VLAN 1002, we should see that we're forwarding this towards the edge port. Okay, this is where the host is connected. This is connected to server 1. And then we have two trunk links that are going up towards these 7Ks. Okay, in this case, I have 5K1 configured as the root bridge. I have its priority set to 0 from a spanning tree point of view. We can see this bridge is the root. Then from 7K1 and 7K2, they should be forwarding down towards the 5Ks. Okay, so if we look at the show CDP neighbors, port 1.3 is going down to 5K1, and port 1.4 is going over to 5K2. So one of them is in the forwarding state, and one of them is in the, actually no, we have the VPC. Okay, the VPC peer link in this case is the root port. Okay, from 7K2, we should be forwarding down towards 5K3. Or excuse me, 5K1, which we are. So if we look at the show spanning tree, VLAN 1002 root, 1003 root, basically what we should be seeing is that the output of this is the same on all four of the switches. Okay, so their normal classical Ethernet spanning tree is all converged. Okay, additionally, let's go to 7K1, 7K2, and let's look at the show IP interface brief. And we have sub-interfaces that are for VLANs 1001 and 1002. Okay, we're not extending 1001 out of the bridge domain or out of the ACI anymore, so let's get rid of that. No interface VLAN 1001. And then same thing on 7K2, show IP interface brief. We have 1002, 1003. So we should be able to ping to 10.0.2.11, which is server 1. Okay, we can ping both from 7K1 and 7K2. And then likewise to 10.03.12, which is server 2. Okay, right now between the servers, though, we're not able to route packets between them because we don't have the gateway configured. So if we can see from server 1 here, it has the address of 10.02.11, gateway of .254. If we ping 10.03.12, do not have connectivity to it. Okay, this is ultimately what we're trying to do, is to take these two different layer 2 subnets, layer 2 bridge domains, VLANs essentially, we're connecting them from the 7Ks, the classical Ethernet network, into the ACI, and we're going to be using the ACI leafs as the default gateways for the servers. Okay, so we're doing just normal trunking from the 7Ks point of view. So let's leave this ping running, and then after we're done with the config on the APIC, the final result should be that we have connectivity to this, this particular destination. Actually, let's start with our gateway first. Okay, our gateway is going to be 10.02.254. Okay, if we do let's look at ARP-A, and we have 10.02.254, we can see it's that Anycast address that is on the ACI leaves. Okay, so let's leave this ping going, and we're going to modify our previous configuration. So if we look at the physical topology from the leafs, this is from the leafs of the ACI. This is ports 1 and 2 that are going down to the 7Ks. Okay, so the next step is I'm going to delete the previous configuration where we were extending the bridge domain using the same endpoint group. And the way that I can do that is by simply removing the interface policy group configuration under the Fabric tab. And then if we go back under the application EPG, we're going to delete them from being deployed on those particular interfaces. Okay, so under configure the switch interfaces, I'm going to delete port 11. And here with the X. There we go. So we're deleting the interface selector. Submit. Configure interface port channel. Okay, so we see 11 was deleted. Okay, let's do the same thing on leaf 102. So select the interface, click the X. It's going to delete it, and then submit the config. Okay, end result of this is that this local server now should lose reachability to the gateway, which we see it does. Okay, because the physical interfaces are no longer configured. Okay, there's a question here. I think you did the wrong ping. Should we ping between the servers? I'm pinging to the gateway first because the traffic is routed between the two of them. So before we can route the packets between the servers, we need to make sure we can hit the gateway. Once we can hit the gateway, then we'll look at the policy that needs to be applied to the EPGs in order to actually allow the traffic between them. Okay, but again, intra-EPG, remember, is allowed by default. So at a minimum, I should be able to hit the gateway address from the server, okay, which I cannot yet because it's unconfigured. Okay, let's also go back under tenants, under application profiles, and then under application public web servers. This was previously deployed under static bindings, port 101/1/1. So we're going to delete this one. Okay, also I'm going to delete that other EPG, the VLAN 1002. Okay, then last step, we're going to go under Fabric, access policies, pools, VLAN pools, and I'm going to delete the VLAN 1002 from the previous pool. Okay, so right now the only thing that we should have working is that 7K3 is essentially our web server. Okay, so this is going to be running web services. Its address is 1001.73. And if we go to 7K3, we should be able to be pinging our gateway, but we shouldn't be able to ping anything beyond that. So ping 10.0.1.254. Okay, which you can reach, but it should not be able to ping 10.0.2.11, okay, which is server 1. Okay, so now we're going to configure the layer 2 external domain. So we're going to start under the Fabric tab, under Fabric Access Policies. We're going to go back through the wizard for configuring the interfaces. The main change, though, is that when we go to select the domain is not going to be bare metal. It's not going to be physical. It's going to be an external layer 2 bridged domain. Okay, where we can see this from the GUI is a couple different places. Under tenants, under tenant networking, we have our bridge domain and the VRFs, which is going to be for the normal internal traffic to the fabric. Then external bridge networks, this is going to be the L2 out. Okay, now we'll see with the L2 outs, we still need bridge domains associated with them, and we do still need endpoint groups associated with them. But we're going to come back to this configuration after we do the Fabric Access Policies. We're going to do some of this from the GUI and then look at doing some of this from the CLI, where we can basically just copy and paste the config from one subnet to, or not one subnet, but one bridge domain to another. Okay, so we're going to go under Fabric Access Policies, configure an interface port channel and virtual port channel. And this is going to be on both switches at the same time. We're going to do this. Okay, so I'm going to create a new switch profile that is encompassing both of the switches. Okay, leaf 101 and 102, and it's going to be ports 11 and 12 on both of them. It's basically a shortcut for saying that you're just doing trunking on all 4 of those interfaces at the same time. Okay, also in some later examples, we'll come back and use a virtual port channel where we're doing a back-to-back VPC between the leafs and the 7Ks. This is just going to save some time so I don't have to rebuild the switch profiles. I'm going to do that step currently. Okay, so under Configure Interface, Port Channel, Virtual Port Channel, we're going to click plus to select the switches. Select switches is going to be both of them, 101 and 102. We're going to call this leaf 101-102 profile. Under these leafs, we're going to configure individual interfaces, which are 1/1 to 2. We'll call the interface selectors leaf 101 to 102 ports. And then under interface policy group, we'll let it create its own policy group. We'll say that CDP is going to be on, and that's it. Okay, then under attached device type, this is going to be the change. So instead of bare metal, which means physical domain, we're going to be configuring external bridge devices. We're going to create a domain. We're going to say that this is going to be the trunk to, let me zoom in a little bit here. Oop, too far. Okay, this is going to be trunk to 7K1 and 7K2. Okay, VLAN range is going to be whatever we're trunking. So in this case, 1002 to 1003. And again, you could always come back and edit this later. It just has to, you have to create the pool in order to bind it ultimately to the endpoint group. Okay, so VLAN range is created, the domain is created. And let's click Save and Submit. Okay, let's now look at the CLI and see what the end result of this is. So let's go to the APIC. And we'll say terminal length 0 and show run. And we're looking for what is under the leaf config. Okay, so leaf 101 ports Ethernet 1/1 and 1/2. It has policy group leaf 101 to 102 _ 1 -ports 1 -2 _ policy group. Okay, which basically means it's applied to 4 different interfaces. 101, 11, 101, 12, 102, 11, and 102, 112. But notice that there's no actual encapsulation of the interface. The reason why is I haven't created the EPG to actually deploy on the interface. The only thing I've essentially done at this point is just brought the interface up. Now if we go to the 7Ks, we should be able to tell this by looking at the show CDP neighbors. Because remember, I have that interface policy group that was saying turn CDP on, so I can tell that there's some sort of application applied or some sort of config applied because CDP is not enabled by default. Okay, so we have both links, leaf 101, leaf 102. Okay, next step, we're going to go under the tenants. So tenants, under tenant networking, we're going to create an external bridge network. Create bridged outside. We're going to call this our L2 out to 7K1 and 7K2. Okay, so something descriptive, doesn't matter what it is. The external bridge domain is going to be the trunk to 7K1 and 7K2. So this is what I created previously under the Fabric tab. And the bridge domain is going to be one of the bridge domains that we already have created that ultimately is going to be mapping VLAN 1002 towards it. Okay, so BD 1002 in this particular case. Okay, encapsulation is VLAN-1002. And then we're deploying this on all 4 of these ports. So it's going to be leaf 101, port 11, we add it. Leaf 101, port 12, add. Leaf 102, port 11. And leaf 102, port 12. Okay, so I'm basically saying that I'm trunking VLAN 1002 on all 4 of these ports. And it's calling the domain that was defined under the access policies, which essentially is calling it to the Attachable Access Entity Profile, the AEP. Which again, the AEP is how we're gluing the logical tenants configuration to the physical fabric configuration. Okay, calling it through the domain. Okay, next, and then it says, what is the EPG? Okay, so we're going to create an EPG where we'll say that this is going to be the trunks to 7K1 and 7K2 EPG. Okay, we're not actually doing anything with the EPG yet, we're just creating it. Okay, now let's look at the result of this from the CLI. So on the APIC again, we'll say terminal length 0. Okay, I need to type the whole thing, and then show run. And we want to look under the physical ports. So under leaf 101, interface E1/1, it says we now have switch port trunk allowed VLAN 1002. The tenant is INE. The external layer 2 network is the endpoint group called L2 out to 7K1 and 7K2. Then we have the so this is, well, actually no, excuse me. This is the external bridge domain. This is the EPG. Okay, this is applied to all 4 of the interfaces at the same time. So we would essentially now need to take the same config and then replicate it over for bridge domain 1003, which we're going to tag to VLAN 1003. But what I want to do here is we're going to copy the config from the CLI, put it in the text editor, kind of edit the values around to see what the specific config is related to the L2 out. We're going to change it over to VLAN 1003 and then apply it from the CLI as opposed to be applying it from the GUI. Okay, also what we had previously done in the last example where we were extending the EPG out of the fabric is under that bridge domain 1002, we should have already had, so you should be above that. Let me clear the, let me close this and open this back up. Okay, terminal length 0, and then let's log to a file again. Okay, and let's search this for 10.0.2. So we have interface bridge domain BD 1002, which has the IP address and it has the MAC address. So this was defined under the VRF, the bridge domain, the subnet. Okay, without these 3 constructs, we can't actually bridge or route any traffic into the fabric. So it's still needed before the EPG is applied. The difference, though, is that the layer 2 bridge network has its own EPG in this case, as opposed to the previous example where we were sharing the same EPG between the web server, which was a bare metal machine. In our case, it was actually a 7K attached to it. And then in this case, we are doing 2 separate EPGs, which means that we're going to have the contracts. Okay, now at this point, if we look at the server which we did the deployment onto, we can see that now we can reach its default gateway. Yeah, I can't actually bridge any traffic through the fabric yet, though. So if we do a ping to, or I should say route the traffic, if we ping to 10.0.1.73, I technically do have a route to this, but I don't yet have a contract. So the traffic is going to be denied. Okay, we could modify this if we did this similar to the last example. If we were to go to the VRF, and then under the VRF, which is public, we'll say that the policy control enforcement preference is unenforced. The end result of this should now be that we do have communication. Because when it's unenforced, it means that we don't have to have a contract, which is essentially an access list that's permitting or denying the traffic. Okay, in this case, it says like permit IP any. Again, this is one testing use case that when you're building the initial deployment, if you do not have connectivity and you're trying to figure out, well, is this a problem with the objects that I have tied together, or is this normal behavior based on the contracts? The way that you can quickly tell that is just set policy control enforcement to unenforced, and then it should allow all of the traffic through. So if you still don't have reachability after you check this box, then it means that something's broken in your config. Okay, but otherwise enforced, once we submit this, end result is now we should start to drop the frames.